This is part 3 on our series on how to make a newspaper puppet sculpture. And if you haven't looked at the first 2, then it would be helpful to go back and watch those and catch up with us here. Because this is the 3rd step. This is the step where you paper mache your puppet. The materials that we need to do the paper mache part of the process are white glue. We have a huge container here, which you don't need. You just need a small container. This is a little bit too small. To make one puppet, you probably need maybe 6 to 8 ounces of white glue. You need water to dilute your glue. You need a container to mix your water and your glue. And you need newspaper strips. Different sizes, different shapes. And optional is a paintbrush. If you don't want your fingers too much in that, you can use a brush. We begin by mixing our glue and our water. And I'm going to fill this up, not too far, because we're not going to paper mache a whole creature today. We're just going to paper mache some parts as a demonstration. And we ordinarily say it's 1 part of water to 1 part of glue. I like mine gluier, so I have more glue than water in my mix. And so I'm just going to estimate here. I'm not going to measure because I kind of have a feel for it. If you aren't comfortable, you know, you could get a measuring cup or something. And the consistency should be like a pudding. Not too watery. This is too watery, so I'm going to add more glue. I just don't like it when if it's too watery, it takes longer to dry and it's not as hard, and you like that hard feeling of your puppet. If you use just glue, it's too thick and it'll take forever to finish it. If it's too watery, it also takes longer to dry. You could mix this with a spoon or with your brush, but I don't mind touching it, so I'm just mixing it with my fingers. I'm going to add a little more glue. And you can see how my fingers move in the glue, that it sort of keeps its shape when my fingers pass. So I like that consistency. I think that'll work well. We have the puppet that we just finished creating in our last video. He's completely taped. He's very smooth. And so the next steps are to add gluey paper. And we're going to show you first the brush method. So Emma's going to just brush some glue on his body. And if I have a big surface like this, I like to use big pieces of paper.
So I put glue down first to have the newspaper stick, and then I put a little glue over, and that's going to create the shell that we really like.
And you don't have to have strips of paper all in a row. They can go crosswise. They can go up and down the length of his body. And you can go over your pieces, and you should, a couple of times, but if you do it too many times, like if you do it 3 or 4 times, it'll take longer to dry. The second way of paper macheing is to just use your fingers. Now, the good thing about using a brush is that you're not going to tend to get too much glue on your paper. In doing it by hand, you dip your glue into the paint and look closely at Emma's fingers. You don't want to put that gluey strip on in that shape because it's way too much glue. So Emma uses her fingers like scissors almost and goes down the strip of paper to get off the excess glue.
I try to get both sides without too much glue dripping off. You don't need that much, but you need the paper to be wet with glue. And then I find a good spot, kind of working with his curves. And what Susan said, I'm also overlapping the paper. And when it dries, it's going to be nice and smooth and nice and hard.
The other important thing is that you have to cover every nook and cranny of your puppet, because after he's dry, you're going to paint him, and the paint won't stick to the tape. The paint will stick to the paper. Here's the one that I did for Emma to do a demonstration on how to do those little kind of awkward spots. Sometimes it helps to have tiny little pieces, so you've got to get into the little nooks and crannies.
And you could always let this dry and come back and do it again.
Yes, if you don't like the way some parts look.
I have tried my best to use the paper to wrap around this horn. And it will be wrinkly. And what I like to do is maybe use my gluey fingers to smooth down those wrinkles. And what Susan said is the paint will not stick to tape. So we want to make sure there's no tape showing.
I think the ear is the hardest because you have
Let's
to
try
get
the ear.
inside of the ear, in addition to working in a small space on the back of the ear.
All right, I
sorry.
am placing a little piece of paper mache in my ear, following the shape of the ear. Now for the outside. Kind of tucking in the rest of the excess paper.
The other thing that Emma indicated a couple minutes ago is if you have rough pieces, you can just put glue on your hands and rub over the rough pieces with gluey fingers, and that will sometimes smooth things down. You can always adjust the length and the width of your pieces of paper according to the space that you're working in and that you're trying to cover.
I'm going to use a skinny piece for the little nook and cranny of his armpit.
Oh, that's good.
All right.
The tail at the end is kind of hairy.
I could use this brush.
Oh, that's a good idea. That'll just stiffen up this paper a little bit, but it'll still look like kind of separate pieces of hair. And now we have a completely paper-mache rhino. When your paper-mache sculpture is completely dry, then you can begin to paint him. Look at your animal really closely. There are very few animals that are monochromatic in color. That is, they're not usually all one color. The rhino seems kind of close to that, but as I looked at him, like in this top picture, he seemed to have kind of a yellow cast. Maybe that's the light. But I decided that I would use some black and some white to make a gray, but then I added a little yellow and a little brown. And I think what it's done is given him a kind of depth in color. He's not flat in his coloring. And there are places where it's a little blacker and places where it's a little lighter. And that seems more real to me than something that's all flat one color. Some animals are a lot more complicated than the rhino. Here's a fox. This is the fox that we were working on the head for earlier. How many colors do you see in this fox? There's the body, there's black and gray and white. This is kind of a dark brown. This is sort of a sienna color, a kind of reddish brown. And look at the backs of his paws and under his chin. It's kind of white. In this light, it almost looks yellow. His face has a lot of white in it, but it's also gray and black. And his ears are shades of brown. So you have to look really carefully to make sure that you have the colors that you want. You can always mix colors. I, for this one, use black, brown, white, and yellow. But for the fox, I would probably use I have some sienna. I would use that. I might add a little red to it to make it a little bit redder. And so play with your palette a little bit to get the colors that you want for your animal. The kinds of paints I like to use for my puppets is water-based acrylics. It washes off your hands pretty easily, even after it's dry, and it washes up easily from the brushes. And so it's a very practical, but also durable and beautiful set of colors. In choosing what colors you want, check the palette of your animal, but you might just like to have the basic colors. The primary colors are yellow, blue, and red. You can mix those to make greens and purples and lots of other colors. But I also like to always have black, always have brown, and always have white. The great thing about white is that you can take any color and lighten it up. When you use black, it's very dense. And so, for example, in making gray, you use a lot of white and just a little black. If you put too much black in, it goes black. So experiment with small amounts of paints before you make a big bucket of them. I use this for mixing my paints. It's an old muffin tin. You could probably find one at a thrift store. It's not big enough for doing this whole puppet, but for doing details on animals in particular. And if you have a two-toned animal, or if you have animals where there are several colors, like my fox, do a basic color and then go back after it's dried to add other colors so that you don't mix your colors when you're painting. You don't want something to become mud when it's a combination, when there's red next to green. For example, if you do a parrot, you might want to do the red first and then add the green, and just see what colors are next to each other that you run the risk of mixing your colors. And you might need to even do it in 2 or 3 steps to let the colors dry in between. But this is very handy for mixing colors. We're going to add the details to our rhino now. Well, I need eyes. I need nostrils. I need the tail done, the end of the tail, which is also black. And so I have black paint. That's simple for this guy. So we'll use black paint to add those details. We have a brush that's a little bit large. You might want to have 2 or 3 sizes of brushes so you can do tiny details. In this case, this brush is kind of big for the tiny details we need to do, but maybe we could kind of pull the bristles together to do those tiny details. So the other thing that's important is the spacing. I look where his eyes are. His eyes are right underneath the horn. Okay, good. Let's do the other eye and then the nostrils. And then I look at my picture, and the nostrils are straight down from the horn, the big front horn. And so they're like right at the bottom of this part of his snout. He's so cute.
He is. He has a black tail. So you're just making sure to get in there and get all of the little pieces.
You see these creases in his body, in front of his back legs, behind his front legs, and on his neck. I wonder, Emma, could we try to represent those with paint?
Yeah, let's paint his wrinkles. I
Let's
think
try
that's a
it.
great idea.
And Emma's looking at the photo as she paints.
And these details are so important because he just wouldn't look like himself without it. Here is our completed black rhino paper packed, paper mached, and painted puppet.
And now that you've seen all 3 videos on how to create an endangered species puppet, why don't you create one of your own? And thank you for caring about endangered species.
Thank you.